July 1991's push scores, and we find ourselves with a brand shining new WCW World Champion in the total package Lex Luger, in at number one for the first time ever after his being WCW's nearly man for the last 3 years. But there's a whole lot of mess to unpack this month with WCW, so let's get to it with this month's top 10 most push wrestlers, and then we'll update the rolling PMP50 as usual for the last 12 months' scores. So, July 1991 started with quite a bang as WCW Chief Executive Jim Herd fired World Champion Ric Flair after Flair refused to agree a pay cut that would have placed him substantially below both Sting and Lex Luger in the top stars pecking order. And after a fair bit of wrangling, the WCW World title was eventually declared vacant, with a new champion to be determined at the Great American Bash pay-per-view. Initial plans had apparently been A, that Flair dropped the title to Lex Luger at the Great American Bash, B, when that wasn't going to work, that Flair dropped the title to Barry Windham at the start of the month, and then Windham drops the title to Luger at the pay-per-view. But finally, as none of that could be agreed to, Flair just left the company with immediate effect. With the big gold belt, and Flair was still the NWA World Champion at this point, by the way, even though he was stripped of the WCW World title, more of which probably next month when Flair would show up in the WWF with the NWA World title. But anyway, finally Plan C came into effect. US champion Lex Luger and number one contender Lex Luger would fight the number two contender Barry Windham, who comes in at number 6 in our top 10 for July, for the vacant title at the Great American Bash. And I'm going to pause for a bit over that Luger-Windham match because it's become much maligned over the years, and the Great American Bash 91 show it headlined slated as one of the worst pay-per-views of all time. I'll cover the rest of the card in a sec because it is a legitimately awful show, maybe WCW's worst. But let's focus on that title match first. The first thing to make note of is the "We Want Flair" chants. The fans are clearly not happy about the Luger versus Windham match as a replacement for the advertised Luger versus Flair Legend versus Legacy showdown that had been promised. Luger and Windham were in a tough spot here in front of a hostile crowd, and honestly they work a pretty decent cage match in spite of the circumstances. Luger all about the power, Windham all about methodical counter wrestling. They trade sleeper holds, and to be fair, they kind of start to win the crowd over through hard work. So Windham escapes the torture rack, hits a belly-to-back suplex, and starts to gain momentum with a superplex, lariat, and dropkick. But then, in what was supposed to be the match's big twist, former world champion Harley Race and bodyguard Mr. Hughes randomly come out, and Harley tells Luger to go for the pile driver, which was Race's trademark finisher. He does, and Lex Luger duly wins the WCW World title for the first time. The fans do pop for the title change, but it was completely unclear this was supposed to be a major heel turn for Luger. You'll remember the Sting versus Sid match at Halloween Havoc last October, and no one having any idea what happened with Barry Windham dressed up as Sting until it was explained on TV later. Well, they essentially did the same thing again with Luger turning heel here. It wasn't an obvious heel turn because Luger did nothing heelish. He just hit a move and won the match. It was only on TV afterwards that he cut a series of promos with a new arrogant persona explaining the presence of Harley Race as his new manager, making him a new ruthless total package. Apparently Luger was supposed to cut a heel promo in the arena immediately after the match, but they were so behind on time again this month that the explanatory promo got bumped, and we just went straight into the ridiculous second match of the quote-unquote double main event, which was a second cage match pitting Rick Steiner and Missy Hyatt against Arn Anderson and Paulie Dangerously in a mixed tag match. Why on earth was this a pay-per-view main event, you may reasonably ask? And this match was completely changed up too. So originally it was supposed to be the Steiner brothers and Missy versus Arn, Windham and Paulie in a 6-person match. But then Scott Steiner got injured with a bicep tear that put him on the shelf for a few months, and Wyndham got emergency shuffled into the world title match. So it became a mixed tag match rather than a six-person mixed tag. But then that became a handicap match when the powers that be wouldn't let Missy Hyatt wrestle a match against men. So they have the Hardliners team of Dick Murdoch and Dick Slater kidnap Missy at the start of the match to cover that, and then it becomes a Rick Steiner versus Arn Anderson and Paulie Dangerously handicap match. So yeah, I've ranked the Steiner brothers at number 5 this month as a unit because they were still WCW World and New Japan IWGP Tag Team Champions despite Scott's injury. Arn Anderson comes in at number 8 in this month's top 10. I'm not ranking Missy Hyatt or Paulie because they're not wrestlers. In the match, for what it's worth, Rick and Arn briefly go at it. Then Rick just pins Paulie with the Steiner line in like 2 minutes to win it as they're out of time and have to go home. Rick celebrates this big victory by looking like he could not give less of a shit about any of it. It was a baffling anticlimactic end to a wretched show, and WCW was clearly in dire straits and scrambling. Outside of the top 10 for WCW and elsewhere on the Bash pay-per-view, the new TV champions Steve Austin and Terence Taylor beat Bobby Eaton and PN News in an absolutely awful scaffold match. The Freebirds were both US Tag Team Champions and six-man Tag Team Champions with a third member, Bad Street. El Gigante beat One Man Gang in another absolutely dreadful match. The Yellow Dog, which was Brian Pillman in a mask, fought newcomer Johnny B. Bad. Nikita Koloff beat Sting in an actually decent-ish Russian chain match. Sting was still the most over wrestler on the show by a mile. And Ron Simmons, who was getting pushed as a face, defeated Oz. It was all told, it was an awful month for WCW with a dreadful big show, and would pretty much lead to Jim Herd getting finally ousted a few months later, and WCW finally getting good again. But if I can say one good thing about WCW at this midpoint in 1991, though, stuff was at least happening. It was interesting. This was about the time I first got into wrestling as a kid, and there was always stuff going on in WCW. Like, from a fan's perspective in the early 90s, the aftermags were about as close to behind the scenes as you got, unless you were an observer reader. And the real life drama and on-screen dramas were all kind of bundled together into one big storyline. And WCW, I shit you not, seemed genuinely exciting and unpredictable to a young fan at this time. Like, was the product awful? Yes. Was the booking a dog's dinner? Yes. But was it interesting to follow? 100% yes. It really did feel genuinely exciting and unpredictable to follow. Anyway, that's just my take and why I started to prefer WCW to the WWF as a kid, even though it was clearly a mess. So, moving seamlessly onto the WWF for July 1991, by contrast, virtually nothing was happening. It was like they'd been stuck on repeat or in limbo for the last 4 months. I think losing Saturday night's main event was really hurting them in terms of keeping things fresh with big angles to progress stories. And for the 4th month running, we just had Hulk Hogan versus Sergeant Slaughter, who are in at numbers 2 and 3 in Desert Storm matches, and The Ultimate Warrior versus The Undertaker in at numbers 4 and 7 in body bag matches, again as the WWF's big 2 house show programs. Okay, things were somewhat in crisis behind the scenes, as Dr. George Zahorian had just been found guilty of distributing steroids to wrestlers, and world champion Hulk Hogan had appeared on the Arsenio Hall show as Damage Control, claiming he'd only ever taken steroids once to rehab an injury, which turned out to be, spoiler, a big fat porky pie. But on screen, the WWF product from April to July of this year was just in drift mode. The announced card for next month's SummerSlam pay-per-view would be Hogan and Warrior against the Iraqi Triangle of Terror of Sergeant Slaughter, Colonel Mustafa, and General Adnan in a handicap match, refereed by the debuting Sid Justice, WCW's Sid Vicious. So the arrival of Sid should at least shake things up a bit. Elsewhere outside of the top 10 for the WWF, we had the Nasty Boys remain as tag team champions, and they'd face Legion of Doom at SummerSlam. The Big Boss Man would face the Mountie in a jailhouse match. Randy Savage, who was still officially retired but was wrestling house shows again, would marry his longtime manager and real-life wife, Miss Elizabeth, at the pay-per-view. Intercontinental Champion Mr. Perfect, who was nursing a bad back and out injured, would defend against Bret Hart. The Natural Disasters would face the Bushwhackers. Virgil would face Ted DiBiase for the $1 Million belt, and Erwin R. Schuster would make his pay-per-view debut against Greg Valentine. And honestly, SummerSlam just couldn't come quickly enough for the WWF at this point. The final two spots of July's top 10 are New Japan's IWGP champion Tatsumi Fujinami at 9 and All Japan's Triple Crown champion Jumbo Tsuruta at 10. Fujinami, alongside the greatest 18 champion Riki Choshu, remained the two veteran faces of New Japan, often teaming up with Shinya Hashimoto. Fujinami also fought singles matches this month against veteran Brad Rheingans and Puerto Rico's TNT, who was touring with them. In All Japan, Jumbo continued to lead his Tsuruta stable against the Super Generation Army, while elsewhere Steve Williams and Terry Gordy regained the All Japan Tag Team titles from Stan Hansen and Danny Spivey at the start of the month, only to shockingly then lose them to the Super Generation Army team of Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada at the end of the Summer Action Tour, which I'm going to call my match of the month for July, as much for the significance of the Super Generation Army finally winning some gold as for the quality of the match. I'll put a link to that match in the description, as usual, though I've only been able to find the last 10 minutes of a 30-minute match, but they're a cracking 10 minutes though. Quick territories roundup, and then on to the PMP50 update. So in Memphis, USWA champion Jerry Lawler continued to fight off Eric Embry and Leatherface, and lost the USWA belt to the huge Awesome Kong, who was managed by Embry at the end of the month. In Portland, the Pacific Northwest Territory was really starting to toil to stay afloat at this point, with Steve Doll as the PNW champion there. So, how do the push scores for July affect the rolling PMP50? As ever, the PMP50 updates on a rolling month-by-month basis, with weighted push scores for each company dependent on how big they were at the time. So we subtract the points for July 1990 and add the scores for July 91 to cover the 12-month period of August 1990 to July 91. And the top 10 for the year remains exactly the same as last month. Warrior had been WWF World Champion for 6 of the last 12 months, Hogan for 4, and Slaughter for 2. WCW's Ric Flair and Sting remain 4 and 5. New Japan's Tatsumi Fujinami 6, and the WWF's Randy Savage, Earthquake, Mr. Perfect, and Texas Tornado still round out the top 10. Big movers in the top 30 are New Japan's Riki Choshu, who bumps back up to 11, with Jumbo, the Legion of Doom, Stan Hansen, and Ted DiBiase completing the top 15. New WCW World Champion Lex Luger moves up to 19. The WWF's Undertaker moves up to 21. And WCW's Arn Anderson and Barry Windham, whom I'm keeping as a unit for now, as they'd been one for most of the last year, move up to 22 after both filling the main event gulf left by Ric Flair's departure this month for now. WCW's El Gigante keeps climbing at 27, while All Japan's Miracle Violence connection Steve Williams and Terry Gordy return to the top 30 at 29. Further down the 12-month rankings, the WWF Tag Team Champions, the Nasty Boys, continue to climb at 35. USWA Champion Jerry Lawler moves back up to 36. And I'm finally splitting up the former WCW Tag Team Champions Doom, with Ron Simmons climbing a couple of spots to 44 as a result of his singles push, and Butch Reed dropping out of the top 50 altogether. The only outright new entry, signified by the yellow circle this month, is WCW's Flying Brian Pillman, who'd been racking up consistent points in the first half of the year and makes his PMP debut at 46. So that means, as well as Butch Reed, we say goodbye this month to ravishing Rick Rude, who'd been sitting out his WWF contract after quitting shortly after last year's SummerSlam. And that leaves us with the WWF still dominant with 28 of the 50 spots this month, WCW slowly increasing its presence with 10, New Japan and All Japan with 5 spots each, and 1 apiece for the USWA and EMLL. So, yep, join me next time for August 91 and how the WWF's big SummerSlam pay-per-view shakes up the pro wrestling pecking order. Please do like, share, subscribe, leave any comments below, and keep on with me through the toughness that was 1991, looking at who was being pushed hardest and where. Thanks for watching. Cheers.